The Nash Manor basement. My grandparents on my mom's side were, how you might say, unique. Good people, just odd. My grandmother was very free-spirited. She was the very picture of positivity, had several crafty hobbies, and always made sure everybody was well and taking care of themselves. She wore very bold outfits, either cute clothes with lots of color pop, or big flowy skirts and blouses of darker hues. My grandfather, on the other hand, dressed like a college professor, always wore button-downs with the tweed jackets, took a lot of pride in how he displayed himself. He enjoyed reading, learning, constantly gaining knowledge, even if it wasn't something that concerned his daily life or he even agreed with completely. He liked to know everything he could on a topic. The two loved each other deeply. They would do almost everything together, frequently go on trips or try new things. They were not complacent people. This was evidenced by their home. After Mom and Dad got married, but before I came along, my grandparents moved out of the suburbs to an old yet refurbished house called Nash Manor. Or that was what it had been called many years ago, obviously not when my grandparents lived there. It wasn't some huge mansion, but still a large and stately house that spoke to an air of the refined gentleman and his wife with a zest for life. Long ago, some person by the surname of Nash had built it as a second home, but his wealth was fleeting, and he had to sell. The home had gone through the hands of some other owners and a historical society before being put up for auction, which is how my grandparents came to own it. Nash Manor was situated some distance from the nearest neighbor. It sat in an area adjacent to some woods on one side, hills on another, a small river well off the back of the property. It had the big wrought iron fence all the way around, sizable driveway leading up to an almost ominous two-story dwelling. Inside, there was a sitting area that opened up into a large lobby with an ornate staircase leading to the second floor. As mentioned, the house had been renovated not long ago, and the upstairs was the most modern-looking portion. There was a full guest bathroom, 2 guest rooms, one which had some toys in it for me when we visited, and the master bedroom with the private bath. Downstairs, while updated, retained much of the older aesthetic, and everything was based off one long hallway that ran under the stairs from one side of the house to the other. From left to right, there was a large living room, dining room and kitchen area, a powder room, Grandma's craft room, and then some more distance at the end of the hall was Grandpa's study. We lived a few hours from Grandma and Grandpa, so we'd try to visit around holidays and a couple other times through the year. When I was little, I spent most of my time in either the living room or the playroom. Occasionally, I'd go with Grandma to her craft room and watch her paint or whatever, but I never really went all the way down to the study. Until one time we were visiting, I was probably 6. I woke up really early one morning, and my parents were still asleep. I went downstairs to see if anybody was up, and when I got down to the hallway, I saw the study light on from afar, so I toddled down to see if Grandpa was in there. He was reading some paper or magazine, and he seemed genuinely startled to see me there. He kind of jumped, then laughed, saying, "Didn't expect to see you there, son." He invited me in, and I finally got a good look around. The office was the most original-feeling part of the house. The huge desks, the big overstuffed mahogany leather chair, shelves and shelves of books ranging from light reading to large fiction serials to editorials to deep dives into whatever obscure subject you could think of. We talked for a little bit, and he finally offered to go make me some breakfast. As I went to turn around, I noticed something I never knew was there. Though the study was literally on the back wall of the hallway, the room itself opened up to the right somewhat. So from the middle of this room, looking out into the hall, I saw an odd alcove with a door to the left. No way you'd know it was there unless you were in the study. Childhood curiosity, I asked Grandpa, "What's in there?" He very quickly said, "It's just the basement, nothing but storage down there." And that was that. I didn't think anything of it. As we continued to visit them, I would on occasion join Grandpa in his study. As I got a little older and took an interest in reading, I started to ask about some of the books. He explained to me that many were of his own collection, but a handful were there when he bought the house, motioning to a small bookcase on the far wall. He said these were mainly old record books or descriptions of events that had occurred in the area decades on decades ago. He was always dismissive of them, though. He'd ask if I wanted to read or even borrow almost any other book, but we never paid too much attention to those books on the far shelves. And every time I went to leave the study, there stood that weird basement door on my way out. One that, as I got older, I became more curious of. I had no reason to go down there, and yet I felt a need to see whatever was in that basement. I came to realize that I was never in the study alone. Grandpa was either already there, or if I went in there myself, he would seemingly appear within minutes and wouldn't leave the room until I did. When we finally did exit, it was together, and he was always close by, like he was making sure I didn't linger back there too often. I slowly put together that maybe he didn't want me to go into the basement. And it made sense. Old house, probably dank and dark, and was just storage. Wasn't even worth asking about, right? So I just let it go. But still, every time we went to leave that office, my eyes seemed to lock onto that door for more than a few seconds. By the time I was 15 or so, Grandma's health had been declining fast. She seemed to get frailer each time we saw her, and she was in and out of doctors' offices and the hospital quite often. Grandma and Grandpa both were getting up in age. They had my mother later in life. But still, it was hard seeing this vibrant woman take a sudden turn. I could tell it was especially hard on Grandpa. Even so, he took her to every appointment and stayed with her in the hospital every day and many nights as well. He was by her side when her time was finally up. He was heartbroken. Mom stayed with him for a couple of days right after, and we all stayed with him during and right after the funeral. It was a tough time, but my grandpa stayed strong and did eventually work through the initial grief. However, he was never quite the same after that. Grandpa had a few friends he could go see, and of course he had my family, but he lost his best friend. He started to wear his hair in a more relaxed style and didn't dress quite as conservatively, I guess as a subtle memorial to Grandma. He seemed okay for long periods of time, but he would occasionally zone out and retreat into his own world. We continued to visit, but the house seemed not as bright as it once was. Obviously, a big part of that was that my grandma's presence was no longer there, but everything started to get a little run down and dirty. But there was almost more to it than that. Grandpa would spend lots of time in his study, and it got to where whenever I'd go back to check on him, he would either be spaced out or deep in some odd book, sometimes one that looked like it had come off that far shelf. It also seemed like when I was approaching the study, the hallway was longer than I had remembered, like it took more deliberate steps to get to the end. There was almost a static in the air, and sometimes when I'd come around the corner into the room, it'd sound like Grandpa was talking to himself in a whisper, but it wasn't his voice. He'd snap to real quick and get up and insist we go back into the living room or go out somewhere for a meal or a treat. Then the return trip down the hall was normal length and no weird noises. This is where it all came to a head. We were visiting him the summer after I turned 17. We had all gone to bed, and I was struggling to get to sleep. For some reason, I was feeling a tension in the air not unlike that which I experienced down near the office, but I did eventually drift off to sleep, only to be woken up by an intense nightmare. I can't recall what happened in it. I just remember seeing some creepy imagery, and it felt like something was breathing over my shoulder the whole time. I finally shot up, looked around the room. Nothing was out of place, but the entire house seemed uncomfortably quiet. No fans or appliances running, no wind outside, no settling of the house as the summer heat started to set in. A pin could have dropped anywhere in that dark room, and I could have pointed to the exact spot it landed. I had to get up and walk around, get some water or something. I worked my way downstairs, through the dark initially, to see a dim light coming from down the hallway. Grandpa still up? I thought to myself. I walked around the corner and looked down the long corridor to see a silhouette standing in front of the office. They looked like they were staring intently at that basement door. This gave me a shock for obvious reasons, but I realized it was just Grandpa. I started to walk toward him and call out, but he suddenly cut his gaze in my direction and was now staring me down. This gave me chills yet again. I wasn't sure in the moment that it was Grandpa. He finally turned his body and started to shuffle toward me, then began to fall to his knees. I rushed over and helped him up. He said he was having chest pains. I helped him to the kitchen and ran up to get Mom. We huddled around him and made sure he was okay. He seemed delirious, and Mom decided he needed to go to the hospital right then. So off they went at 2 a.m. to the hospital to get him looked at. Dad and I stayed back at the house, and we went through and started turning off lights. I looked back down the long hallway to see that the study light was still on. That little warning alarm that turns you away from would-be danger, even though it's not obvious, was screaming at me. It was just a room, in a house I'd slept in several times all through my childhood with no incident. And yet, something was just not right here. Something about Grandpa being gone somehow made this house feel foreign to me, like I was a trespasser and not welcome. But for some reason, I couldn't leave that light on as much as I wanted to. So I finally mustered up the courage, it's just a room, and marched down toward the end of the hallway, eyes forward the whole time. I came around the corner to see the glow was from Grandpa's desktop lamp, so I had to go into the room to turn it off. I then saw that he had several books scattered across his desk, and every one of them came from the far shelf. The one that was most front and center seemed to be a genealogy book, one of those the group moved to this area and begot this group kind of deals. Thing is, the page he was turned to had huge scribbles all over it, whole sections of text blotted out. I noted the name Wilson Nash, who had been the original homeowner, a few times across these pages. I was trying to decipher what little was legible when I felt an ice-cold draft from the door. I quickly turned around, and my heart sank. In the dim light being cast out from the study, I could see that the basement door, which had always been closed, now stood wide open. Was it like that the whole time? I was so focused with getting into this room earlier that I didn't even look over at it. Perhaps I assumed it would be closed? Or maybe I had hoped it would be. There was no reason for the door to be open, right? Grandpa had been standing there. Maybe he had gone down and didn't close it back before collapsing. But I felt like I would have noticed the door open, even trying to tend to my ailing grandfather. Maybe it wasn't closed all the way, and some draft kicked it open. I was trying to find every logical reason for this door suddenly inviting me to come take a look inside. Slowly, I began to advance on the door. I had no light source on me, and what little light came from the office stopped right at the threshold to the basement. It was like there was black felt hanging inches from my face. I put my hand out into the darkness. Man, it was cold in there. I reached around on the other side of the wall, trying to find a light switch. Success. I flipped the switch, and a single dim bulb produced an almost sickly yellow light throughout a very boxy room that descended some feet down. The staircase in front of me was steep and creaky, probably the original planks from when the house was built. I made my way slowly down, noting that indeed there were some industrial-looking shelves down here with boxes and bags of different sizes and shapes cluttered all around. I also noted that the light bulb was, ever so slightly, swinging back and forth, the dull yellow glow dancing about on the stone and mortar walls. I finally made it to the bottom and turned to take in everything. At first glance, yep, it was a basement. Why had I wanted to come down here so bad? But then the realization set in. There was a reason Grandpa always tried to play down the importance of the basement and herd me away from this side of the house. Something was down here, and it probably was not friendly. But since I was here now, I figured I should look around. The room, although primarily box-shaped, had an area in the corner opposite from the stairs that looked to be a very small passage. I began walking that direction, and each step felt like I was wearing lead shoes. I could see another set of shelves in that passage, with some odd boxes on them that were piled up in a very particular way. I didn't get much closer to them, though, before the bulb above me blew out suddenly. This caught me off guard. I let a small yelp before realizing that I still had some light coming from the door above. Then the door slammed shut. I was locked in with whatever had been lurking in this basement. I flew back in the direction of the stairs, trying to rely on memory as I crossed the hard floor with bare feet and trying not to bash my toe on a century-old piece of lumber. I did stumble and fall about halfway up, and I felt a cold weight on my back, and I thought I heard soft, cheeky laughter. This sent my adrenaline into overdrive, and I propelled myself on up the stairs. I wrapped my hands around the doorknob and tried to twist. It was locked from the outside. I used every bit of strength I had to shake and rattle that door, hoping it would somehow break loose and let me out. I started yelling, loud as I could, hoping my dad might hear me upstairs. I felt the presence at my back, almost like something was breathing on my neck. My nightmare was coming true. It was right behind me, bearing down. I started to panic, just shrieking for my dad to come, feeling more and more cornered. I didn't need to turn around, I kept telling myself. Finally, almost like I lost control, I turned and saw the pale, distorted face of a woman nose to nose with me, her eyes wide, staring through to my soul. I felt faint and started to black out, right as I heard the door open up behind me and I fell into my dad's arms. He pulled me up and I watched the woman's face fade quickly from view. He slammed the door hard and locked it back, then propped me up against the wall until I regained full consciousness. When everything came back into focus and he made sure I was okay, he helped me to my feet and determinedly said, "That's it, we're selling this place. I don't care what her dad says, I knew this house was hiding something. Come on, we're not staying here. We'll find a hotel and come back tomorrow to get the rest of our stuff." We went upstairs long enough to get some shoes and outside clothes on, then left for the hotel. That night, Dad explained to me that he had always had an odd feeling about that house, and he wondered if somebody wasn't buried in the basement because of how Grandpa had acted when they were moving in. Dad offered to help move some things down there, but Grandpa insisted he would handle it later. He also explained a little of the history of the house. The Wilson Nash was someone who came into money and went wild, buying extravagant things and living on the edge. He had taken a lover other than his wife, and as that situation imploded, this house was either supposed to be her house as a payoff to keep his name clean, or perhaps a place he would eventually live with her when his first marriage dissolved. Supposedly, that second woman had become pregnant, but records were fuzzy on if she ever had the child or not. At some point, Nash's money ran out, and he had to sell off a lot of assets quick. Coincidentally, about the same time, the second woman passed away, and Nash allegedly had arrangements made for a very private funeral. So, was there something down in the basement tying that woman's spirit to the house? And furthermore, why would Grandpa continue to live there if he knew of this? Dad did go on to explain that Grandpa had gotten more standoffish since they had moved in, and he suggested that Grandma's presence was helpful in keeping things calm, but maybe since she had died, that spirit had been slowly working on Grandpa and finally got to him. We talked for a while before drifting off to sleep, which was amazing. I had no nightmares and awoke mid-morning feeling really refreshed. Dad called Mom to see if Grandpa had been seen yet. They had been able to get to him pretty quickly and had run some tests throughout the early hours of the morning. Turns out he had some form of very minor heart attack, but there were no classic signs of heart disease. They had also medicated him heavily, and he had been in a very deep sleep for some hours. Mom spent the night in his room and woke up before he did and was standing over him, watching. She said it was the weirdest thing. When he woke up, they talked briefly about what had happened. Then he turned away and very matter-of-factly said, "I want to sell the house." He wouldn't explain further. Dad cryptically said, "I think I know why, but you just tend to him for now." Dad and I went back to the manor. The sun was up, and it wasn't nearly as intimidating as it had been the night before, but there was still this feel about it. We walked through the front door, which for some reason took a little more effort than I remember to open. Everything was as we had left it the night before, lights still on everywhere, basement door still locked tight. But it was deathly quiet. The air wasn't moving. We went to work gathering our things and some of Grandpa's things so he wouldn't have to come back. I went into the office one more time and looked around, taking it in for what may be the last time. With the sun up and beaming through the window, everything felt safer. And with Dad involved now, I felt emboldened. Before we left, I wanted to make one final run down into the basement, prepared, ready to confront whatever this was, and see for myself what was anchoring this hateful soul to this home. I asked Dad what he thought, and if he would go with me or at least watch the door again. He at first didn't want to push our luck. But as we loaded the car up with the last bit of luggage, he handed me a flashlight. Just one more peek, but if anything goes wrong, we are out of here. We walked confidently back to the basement door. We had the buddy system and the power of daylight on our side. Nothing bad would happen, right? We opened the door with spunk at first, but as our eyes set into the void once again, we both paused. How can it be that dark? I shined my flashlight in and down the stairs, scanning for anything nefarious. Nothing. Dad brandished his own flashlight and took station in the doorway, making sure it wouldn't close again, and shining his light down on and around me while I used mine to navigate. I steadily made my way down the stairs and around the odd passage I had seen earlier that morning. I was able to get close to the shelf, and through the boxes placed there, I could see a portion of wall that looked like it wasn't completely filled in. As I leaned in to investigate, my throat felt like it closed up, and I got a cold chill like I've never felt before. I hesitated for a moment. Dad asked if I was okay, and I confirmed I was before reaching my hand out to start moving the boxes around. With them out of the way, I did indeed see a section of wall that was hollowed out. I leaned in even further and saw in that cutout a relatively small, flat, nondescript box, all by itself. I shined my light on it for a few seconds, trying to guess what it could be. Dad called down, asking if I found something. I answered, and after a moment he said, "You may not want to touch that." However, I was already reaching out to do just that. I put my index finger against the side of the box and slowly lifted it up to see how heavy it was. From all around me, there came a howling screech unlike any I'd ever heard. It echoed all through the basement, sounding for a few strong seconds before devolving into short, breathy screams. As I had before, I took off for the stairs and flew up them, my dad urging me on the entire time. I hit the top and we both sprinted out to the car, Dad using choice words to describe how he felt about the house as he cranked up and we drove away. I stared at the house, trying to shake the fear of the moment off, but I got one last jolt as I saw in one of the large front-facing windows a pale figure watching us as we drove away. Grandpa went into a retirement community and sold the house back to the Historical Society. He had no idea that was down there when he bought it. Being an auction, he didn't really get to see the whole thing before making the purchase. However, the presence didn't seem malevolent at the time. He just assumed it was to be left alone and wouldn't bother anyone. He had pieced together the theory that it was the spirit of Nash's mistress, who may have met an early demise at the hands of Nash when he fell from glory and went a little insane, and he tried to cover it up by hiding the evidence down below. I told him about the odd box I saw, and we gruesomely guessed it was her remains stowed away, which may have been why she was still tied there. Grandpa hired some people to go into the house to fetch exactly what he wanted out of there, which they did, but they commented that they felt like they were being watched the entire time. The Historical Society rep who bought the house back from Grandpa showed great interest when he admitted that it was likely haunted. The rep figured it would make a good tourist attraction. None of us were particularly surprised when, a few months later, that house was bulldozed and completely wiped from the earth. Grandpa was honestly happy about it. What had been a mild suggestion of the paranormal began to eat away at his sanity, and he was finally free of it. As for me, the trapped feeling, the face, the screams, the whole experience is drilled into my mind. I will always check the background on any house I buy, and make sure nothing is buried in the basement.